The way that woody perennials form, you have the trunk, and then from the nodules, the growth nodules that are on there, as that starts to sprout and your limb forms, the limb actually grows around the trunk, and then the trunk will then grow around the limb, and that's what forms that connection, and that creates this knobby tuberosity that you kind of see on there, and that's called the branch bark ridge, right? So just understanding that, that's really the key to understanding how to properly prune a tree. So trees are what is known as a self-compartmentalizing organism. In the wild, when a branch breaks, what the tree will do is attempt to close off where that connection point is, so that it's no longer sending nutrients out into, say, like a stub or something like that, and it can focus on healing and then redistributing any of the nutrients that were going there. So when you're pruning a tree, what you want to take into account is what is the structure of my branch bark ridge, and that branch bark ridge is always going to be pruned in the opposite of what your branch bark ridge is, or your inverse of the branch bark ridge. So if your branch bark ridge, say like on a citrus, is almost perfectly vertical to the trunk, your cut is going to be to the outside of the branch bark ridge, but vertical. On a stone fruit, a lot of times you'll get like a branch bark ridge that's going to be kind of slightly angled. You can call it roughly like a 45-degree angle. So that cut is again going to be to the outside of the branch bark ridge at the inverse angle. Right?
So 45 back towards the...
Don't think about it as a 45. It's always going to be the inverse of the branch bark ridge. So how that would work here, so I'll say we'll address this limb right here. So you can see we have our tuberosity, which is called the what?
Branch bark ridge.
Correct, the branch bark ridge. So you can see there's that one hard little edge within that tuberosity. The side that is closest to the trunk, that's where we don't want to impede our cut, right? We want to do it to the outside of that. So what I'm going to do is, because an elderberry is essentially like a citrus, it's that vertical kind of cut. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in with my hand pruners, and I want to get as close to that branch bark ridge as I can without cutting into the trunk. And I'm just going to make a smooth, straight cut all the way through, okay? Now, what ends up happening, because it is a self-compartmentalizing structure, now the tree, because I've just left that small nub that's on there, the tree is going to stop sending nutrients out to here. It's going to close that area off, and now this little nub is going to become just dead tissue, okay? So before I go any further, questions about any of that stuff. So we have the branch bark ridge. Our pruning cut is always going to be the inverse of our branch bark ridge. And then the tree, after we make our cut, will compartmentalize this section, and then we have that little nub of what will be dead tissue.
What if you go a little too far and you cut into that?
That's where I'm going right now. Okay, so whenever we make one of those cuts that then goes into the trunk, what ends up happening is the tree can't close that area off. So now it's going to keep trying to send nutrients to that area to help try to close that up, but because of the anatomy of the tree, the way that the limb attaches itself to the trunk, it can't ever close that up. So now what we've done, it's just like giving yourself a cut on your arm. They have a very similar vascular structure. Just like we have veins and arteries, their cambium, which is their vascular system, is made up of the xylem and the phloem. So when you cut into the cambium of a tree, which is that 1/16 of an inch below the bark, we've now just exposed the tree's vascular system to pathogens. And if, like, especially in an area like this where we have like fusarium wilt is pretty common because we have so many eucalyptus around. If the tree were to become exposed, now its vascular system is open, now it's susceptible to systemic infection. And then, because like how we were talking about, trees secrete enzymes, now as they start to get sick, their enzymes change, and that's when you start to see that downward escalation of decline. And now other like invertebrate pathogens are now aware that, oh, okay, well, here's a sick tree. And that's a big part of the issue that we see with like the boring weevils and the beetles, the bark beetles, that kind of stuff. Like, that's what they're responding to. So when we cut into the trunk, when we impede the branch bark ridge, like that would technically how we want to talk about it, is impeding the branch bark ridge, the tree can no longer self-compartmentalize that. And now we've just exposed it to pathogen exposure. Questions on any of that? No? Okay, so then how that's the basic anatomy and physiology that we want to think about when we're pruning all woody perennials. They all have that same basic structure. Yes?
So if you impede on the bark ridge,
Yep.
how do you...
You can't. Nope.
Not even like cutting off the whole, that would do when they get
Yeah, it would just make it worse. Yeah, that would be like, you know, you gave yourself a cut on your forearm, so now I'm going to cut my hand off to try to fix that situation. Now I've just made everything that much worse, right? So now, rather than just having a small intrusion, now you've just created a gaping wound. And oftentimes with trees, their metabolism is substantially slower than ours, right? So you're not going to necessarily see decline as quickly in a tree as you will with us, but guaranteed, eventually, it's going to happen. When trees get gaping wounds like that, I mean, they do have the ability, like you'll see trees that, like oaks, where they'll have a major wound or a burn, and, you know, a third of the tree will be gone, but everything else around it will still be alive. That's because of the way that their vascular system is circumferential on the outside of the tree, just underneath the bark. But over time, that tree is going to move into decline. So
on the inverse point
Yep.
again.
Yep.
If it's angled, so this one was angled slightly.
Yep.
Like this. The inverse doesn't mean the opposite.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Sorry. So inverse is just the opposite of.
So if it's angled like this, you want to angle it like this.
Correct. Yep. Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. So let's see. Okay. So this guy's slightly different. Its branch bark ridge is slightly different. So rather than doing like that same kind of straight up and down cut, I'm going to just mirror that and like so. Okay.
Would it be fair to say that you want the exposed surface, the exposed cut surface, to be as round and as small as possible?
As small as possible. Yes, absolutely. And the reason behind that, so that leads us now into thinking about why are we making our cuts and how does that fit into the long-term, the life of what we're trying to accomplish here in the food forest. When this limb here, as the tree gets bigger, is never going to be up here. It always stays right there. How trees grow is they grow vertically and laterally. Okay? So this cut is always going to stay here, but what's going to happen is that tree gets thicker, it eventually encapsulates that. That's why, like, when you see like lumber, and there's knots in it, and that knot might be 4 or 5 inches into your piece of wood. That's because at some point in time, there was a limb came off, and now that tree has grown around that, and so now you have that piece of dead tissue inside the living tissue. On a tree of this size, it's not such a big deal, but on your fruit trees, on larger landscape trees, this, how you make your prune cuts and the amount of dead tissue that you leave on there becomes really important, especially with like a eucalyptus, because as that becomes encapsulated in that living tissue, there's always going to be that one small section where there's dead tissue, and that compromises the structure of the tree. If it's small, it's minor, right? And over time, it's kind of inconsequential depending on how big the tree gets. But when you, like a lot of the trees that I've seen here, you'll have knobs that are 1 inch, 2 inch, 3 inches. So now thinking about that as it gets bigger, that's a major structural deformity over time. So the smallest that we can make that cut, the better. But what's the important thing to remember is how the limb attaches to the trunk, which is our what?
Branch bark ridge.
Branch bark ridge. Correct. Yep. Okay. So questions before I go forward, because there's one other component that I want to add in here to be thinking about how it fits in, how our pruning fits into the overall concept of the food forest and what we're trying to accomplish. No?
Can you explain a little bit if you don't make a clean cut and you peel the bark back too much?
Oh yeah,
what
sure,
happens?
Yep, absolutely.
And why you don't want to do that?
So, okay, so the way that the tree develops that branch bark ridge, right? So my arm is the trunk, and then we have our limb that comes off, okay? So the way that the limb is formed, right? Remember how I said it does what? Wraps around the trunk, right? From a growth nodule. So the strong connection point is at the bottom. The top of where that limb starts is always going to be your weakest connection. So when you're, say, making a prune cut on a heavy limb and you cut down from the top without making I'm kind of going to jump head here a little bit just on a technical term, but you usually make an undercut whenever you prune. So if you don't make your undercut and you just do your top cut, so that upper section wants to let go, that bottom section doesn't, right? And then a lot of times, like you'll see this when people are pruning big trees with a chainsaw and they do a drop cut, and you'll see that limb come down, and then that bottom connection just holds, and then it pulls a little bit, and then you'll get this long peel, right? So do you remember what I said about the plant's vascular system? What did I say about the plant's vascular system?
When if it's exposed, it's gonna bring some pest.
Correct. And
16th.
yeah, it's that living tissue directly below it. So when you get those long peeled barks, you've just made a deep cut right into the vascular system, and that tree will not be able to heal that. It's eventually what will end up happening is that living tissue will die, but it's not going to form that protective barrier that actually happens. Like literally the tree will just close that off. So now nothing can penetrate that anymore. And so pests can't get in, nutrients aren't going out. Right? So that's why it's really important to be aware, especially like as we start to make cuts on the bigger trees, like there's cork oaks in there. A lot of the Cape wattles are starting to get larger limbs on them. The Cape wattle is one of those trees, though, that because of how fast it grows, like there is some pliability in there, but that's not something we want to be taking into account when we're pruning, right? We want to be thinking that all trees are going to be, they need this to be successful. So, did that answer? Perfect. Okay, so now when we're making our pruning cuts, what we're trying to accomplish here with these trees and the Cape wattles is we're growing green mulch. As these particular, well, the albesias, or they're not albesias, but the Cape wattles, that tree takes atmospheric nitrogen out of the soil or out of the air and places it into the soil. As these trees are growing, whatever nutrients are in the soil get held up into the plant's tissues. So these particular trees that put on a lot of biomass, the reason we use them in a food forest is because we're growing our long-term mulch. And like you can feel the difference in the shade right here as opposed to when we're standing out there, right? So these guys are actually operating what is referred to in ecology. It's a nurse plant. it creates a small microbiome that gives us the ability to work outside of what we'd be able to do if we're over here. You know, like in this area right here, like I thought I saw a comfrey somewhere. Yeah, here we go, right there. Okay, if you had that out there, it's probably going to look a little peaked. It's not going to have as large of leaf structure as it would out here. We can do that because we have these nurse structures. So when we're pruning, we're thinking about how do we increase the ability to maximize our microclimates, and then how do we best take the parts of the tree that we can use to build our long-term fertilization. And then one of the other things that we want to be thinking about is, you know, a lot of this soil is super sandy. One of the major components of your soil structure is organic material. The more organic material you can have in your soil, you're going to increase the ability to retain nutrients. You're going to increase the ability to retain water. And those things are critical to having a healthy soil biota. And with the soil biota, we're talking about aerobic bacteria. We're talking about mycorrhizae. Eventually, we're talking about things like nematodes and larger multicellular life form that are doing the same kind of things that plants are doing. They're moving through the soil. They're ingesting and excreting, so they're manuring in the soil layers, at the root layers. And what those life forms are also doing is, as they move through the soil, they're taking the nutrients that are locked up and making it available to the plants. They chew it up, they make them smaller. As they excrete them, it's in a plant form that can actually then be synthesized by the plant. So when we make our cuts, we're thinking about how we're going to maximize and train these trees to grow and create the microclimates that we want, right? So that's the first thing that I want to be thinking about. Is, so I'm going to look at this tree, and so we have multiple large trunks on this guy right here, and then we have like kind of these smaller ones that are coming out of what's referred to as the root crown. So the way a tree grows, you have your trunk, and then there's that flare that the roots come out of. That's the root crown. When you get growth coming out of that root crown, those are your suckers, right? So with trees like the Cape wattle and the mulberry, they like to sucker a lot. So we can figure out, okay, I like to see these larger structures right here. That's going to be what I want to maximize long term. In the short term, what can I cut out of here to encourage more canopy growth and have the ability to add organic material onto the soil? So I'm looking at, I have these big trunks right here, and I got a whole bunch of just suckered growth. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in close to my root crown, and I'm just going to snap that off. And then I got a couple on the inside here, so I'm watching what my branch bark ridge is, and I'm going to snap those out. And then just take them, and I want to be cutting somewhat small. And the idea here is that I'm adding organic material to the soil to do what?
Build the soil.
Yep. And what, by building the soil, what does that do? Thinking about the ecology, thinking about succession. By putting that organic material onto the soil, what are we providing the infrastructure for?
Growing
The mycorrhizae, yep. The soil biota, that's one.
Microorganisms.
Yep, that's another one. And then
Help
what's
retain water.
that's the big one. That's the big one right there. Like, especially in a Mediterranean climate like ours, that just seems like it's getting hotter. And the past couple of years, we've had less rain than we're supposed to. So the more organic material, the better. All right, so I'm going to come in and I'm just going to cut these up, always being careful of where your hands are. I have gone too fast and given myself hellacious cuts before, and you definitely know when you've done it. All right, so then when I get down to the green stuff,
A little bit smaller.
a little bit smaller, and I drop it right around the tree. So when we see that green stuff, right, there's two major components that we're trying to do with our mulching, right? Carbonaceous material, nitrogenous material. The green stuff, that's our nitrogenous material. So we want that. We want to put that back onto the soil. And then we also want to think about opening up within what we can consider. So this is where like those technical definitions gets a little weird, because there really isn't a crown to this tree, right? And a crown, but you do have like in a fruit tree or the Cape wattles, you have a crown. But what I want to be thinking about is if I'm trying to create an open space, the ability to plant around it, I kind of want to create a dappled shade effect. So I'm looking in here and I can see, okay, well, we got a bunch of small stuff that's moving towards the interior of the tree. And that's the stuff that I'm going to come through and clean out first. I'm going to open that up. I'm going to get in here and I'll make cuts on these guys. Opening this. This is going to be a bad cut. And then I'll come back and I'll prune that out.
How far up would you go?
How far up? That's probably about the most that I would do because we're still pretty young. There's not a whole lot in here. I mean, we got a lot of we got cud weeds coming up and a bunch of weedy stuff that we don't necessarily want to propagate in here. And really at this moment, we want to be thinking about, as well as coming in, we're going to be doing cover cropping so that we can build our soil layers. So I don't want to come too high because I really want to have a nice shady area here so that I can get our grasses started, we can get our clovers started, that kind of stuff. Okay. And I know I'm throwing a lot of information at you, so if at any point in time you need to, just tell me to pump the brakes a little bit. All right, I'm just trying to get in as much as I can so that way you guys can be thinking about this as we move forward. Now, one of the other really important things to build on in thinking about trying to create that microclimate, green mulching, and how we want the tree to develop in the future, whenever we make funny cuts on a tree, like let's say I were to come in on, like some of the cuts I've seen, it's like, all right, well, that's gone. And now I have that right there. You can see if this was a living limb, that right there would be an active growth nodule. So every time we make that funny cut, the tree's like, oh, I need to be able to make as many sugars as I possibly can because now I've just lost that. So it's going to come back and it's going to try to activate that. Right?
Start growing. Okay.
It's going to start growing from there. And then what ends up happening, the more cuts that we make like that, we're reducing the tree's ability to generate sugars, to generate its food sources. Right? So every time we make one of those cuts, any latent growth nodule that's in that area, it's going to activate it. And then you get what's called adventitious growth. And what that tree is doing is like, it's stressed. So it's just going to try to make as many sugars as possible, and it's going to activate every latent growth nodule. So what we're actually doing when we're making those cuts is working against what our long-term goal is creating these kind of slightly lifted nurse trees, right? So we're going to make something that's going to want to be more shrubby as opposed to more tree-like, right? So that's one of the main reasons that it's so important to be making proper pruning cuts. Is every time we make that cut, we're working against where we're trying to go for. So like all of that other stuff, if you can't remember any of that, don't worry about it, because I'm going to start actually doing a little bit more work with you guys, and over time you'll get it. But just remember that every time you make one of those wonky cuts, we're working against where we're trying to go long term, right? So the main things to think about is the branch bark ridge is always going to determine where our prune cut is going to be. We want to be creating a canopy, and we want to open what would be the crown. Okay, those would be the three primary things that I would want you to remember now. Okay. Questions on anything that I've put out there so far?
So the crown on like a fruit tree,
Yeah.
it's the center.
It's when you look at a tree, like what defines a tree is that top, that's your canopy.
That's your canopy.
Yep, that's your
What's
crown.
Your crown?
That's your
Oh,
crown.
That's your crown.
Yep.
So, but this is also the crown.
This is a root crown.
Root crown.
Yep.
Gotcha.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. I know I threw a lot at you in a very short period of time.
Yeah, got it.
Okay. So, one of the other things that should really be anathema to proper pruning is loppers. Loppers are only good for demo. If you're trying to get a tree out of the ground and you're digging it out by hand and you need to stick that lopper in the ground to cut roots, you should never, in the context that we're pruning, ever be using loppers. The way that loppers cut, they do everything that we don't want to do. You cannot get a nice, tight, exact cut. It also crushes the plant tissue and makes for unclean cuts so that the tree can't actually close that off, right? Thinking about it as a self-compartmentalizing organism. So you are not going to see any trained arborist using loppers to do pruning cuts, to do clean pruning cuts, to do proper pruning cuts. Hand pruners, specifically Felcos, are, in my estimation, probably the best tool that you can get. And then having a hand saw. Right? This right there is really what you want to be using. And like they sell, like Home Depot sells like these Coronas and that kind of stuff. Again, demo purposes only. Like if you don't care about the health of the tree, those saws are just fine. But the major difference is if you look at this saw right here, you can see that the teeth are opposite each other and they're also beveled on both sides. Whereas that Corona saw, they alternate, but they're not beveled on both sides. So with this saw right here, every stroke I'm getting a cut from. Whereas those other ones, you'll get a cut and then you get torn tissue. Cut, torn tissue. Right? So for your home orchard, these are the tools that you should get. These are like your basics. And then
You
there's
said that one's just a hand saw.
Yep,
Or-
it's a hand saw.
What's it called?
And this
Pocket boy?
particular company, it's called Silky. It's a Japanese company, and I personally think that the Japanese make some of the best woody perennial tools that you can find out there.
What are the guidelines for when you'd use a hand pruners as opposed to a saw?
Great question. Okay, so hand pruners, if you can make the cut without having to do something like that, use your hand pruners. On something like this, so actually this would be a good one because then I can show you like what an undercut is supposed to look like. So if I were moving, if I were moving along through here, I might use my hand pruners on this just because I've been pruning for a long time and I know how I can apply pressure with just a little bit of movement to get it to cut through and get closer to that heartwood, that center of that limb. But forget I said that. Don't do that. Okay, so a pruning cut, a proper pruning cut, and this is going to be with a small limb with a larger limb. So you can see all of the weight, right, is really going to be out on that outer edge. Right? So anytime you're using a pruning saw, you always want to take it in 3 cuts. Right? So what you're trying to do is reduce weight, make your undercut, and then you're going to make your finishing cut. Okay? So there's your 3. Lose the weight, undercut, finish cut. Right? So in my experience, you're going to find that like people like to take off the weight with varying lengths left on there. If it's a really big limb, I'll do it in multiple. You know, like I might take 2 or 3 cuts just to get a lot of weight off, depending on like, how high up am I on a ladder? Am I sitting in the tree? Like there's a number of things there. But if you think about those 3, right? Lose the weight, undercut, finish cut. So on this guy right here, so I'm going to do my weight cut, and that's going to want to come down right there. So one of the ways that I will do a weight cut, like especially if I need to control it, if I'm in a tight area, I'll do what's called a drop cut, and I'll come through just till it gets to the point where it lets go, and then I'll just finish that. Okay, so there's my weight. Now, on my pruning cut, what's the first thing I want to be thinking about as I come in to prune?
Branch bark ridge.
Correct, my branch bark ridge. So my branch bark ridge on this guy is roughly, we'll call it vertical. So I'll come in, and if my branch bark ridge is right there, I'm going to give myself about 1/4 of an inch, and then I'm just going to make a smooth undercut. All right, so now I've just released that strongest connection point, and then I'll come in at my top cut. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to line up visually where that branch bark ridge is, and then where my bottom is going to come on to. And then just make smooth, straight motions and follow through. So I kind of missed that a little bit, so I'm just going to come back and clean that up just for the sake of the camera. But on an elderberry, I might not even worry about it so much. But if I'm doing someone's, wow, that is terrible. I just made that an awful cut. So on the elderberry, I'm gonna leave it alone. If I were on someone's like landscape tree, I'd spend more time and I'd clean that up. And then probably what I would do is I'd come in here with a hand chisel, a wood chisel, and I would make little line on the top and then come in and just slowly remove that with my hand chisel so that it's finished up nice and smooth. So that was terrible, so let me do a good one for you here. We'll go with this guy. Okay, so I'm gonna lose my weight. I'm gonna make my undercut.
About halfway through.
It depends on how big it is. Yeah. On something this small, I'd probably just carry my undercut all the way through, but for the sake of the lesson, and then I'm going to come in with my top cut. And then bam. And then we're done. That's it. Okay? So lose your weight, undercut, finish cut. And that's across the board. Doesn't matter what trees you're working on. You always want to focus on that. And then the basic pruning techniques is going to be applicable to all woody perennials.
Cool.
Questions? No? Not at the moment?
At this moment, yeah. But
I know.
There's still a lot more, isn't there? I mean,
yeah, so then it's like getting into really like the particulars of each individual species as we move through. Like what's... So...
You wouldn't say this tree is finished.
Oh, God, no.
Yeah.
No, I haven't even started on, like,